A retired grandfather waters his lawn in suburban Sacramento. A factory worker clocks in for another shift in Indiana. A police detective walks the halls of her own precinct. What do they all have in common? They're killers, and for decades, they got away with it. For years, their victims' families waited. They begged for answers. They buried loved ones without knowing who took them, and the cases one by one went cold. But then something changed. Science caught up. A new tool emerged. And suddenly, killers who thought they were safe found themselves staring down detectives holding printouts of family trees they never knew existed. Today, we're diving into 5 cold cases that stayed frozen for decades until science dragged them back into the light. Before we get started, if you're into true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming. Quick question, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. In every homicide squad room across America, there's a place no detective wants their case to end up. Sometimes it's a locked vault in the basement of a courthouse. Sometimes it's a rolling metal shelf shoved against the far wall of an evidence room. In other departments, it's a literal walk-in freezer, boxes stacked floor to ceiling, paper labels curling with age. But no matter what it looks like, every investigator calls it the same thing: the cold case files. A case goes cold when the leads stop coming, witnesses move away or die, anonymous tips dry up. Evidence, if it was ever collected at all, sits in manila envelopes and cardboard boxes, exposed to dust, heat, or simply the forgetfulness of time. Patrol officers cycle out, detectives retire. The city's attention shifts to newer crimes, fresher headlines. But for the families of the victims, nothing about the case is cold. Their lives are permanently split into a before and an after. Before the night, their daughter didn't come home from a dance in Fort Worth. Before a young woman was found murdered in her apartment in Idaho Falls. Before an 8-year-old girl walked around the corner in Fort Wayne and vanished forever. For most of the 20th century, a homicide investigation lived and died on the strengths and weaknesses of human memory. Detectives relied on eyewitness accounts, often chaotic or contradictory. Confessions, sometimes extracted under extreme pressure. Physical traces that could be seen with the naked eye. Fingerprints, fibers, bloodstains. If none of that pointed clearly at a suspect, a case could stall indefinitely. In the 70s and 80s, there was no national DNA database, no forensic genealogy, no way to compare a genetic profile against millions of strangers. That scientific blind spot is one reason violent offenders could terrorize entire regions and then simply vanish into ordinary life. But then, in the late 80s and 90s, everything started to change. Forensic laboratories began to unlock the identifying power of DNA. The idea is simple. Barring identical twins, no 2 human beings share the same full genetic code. If investigators could recover a clean DNA profile from biological evidence left at a crime scene, they could identify or eliminate suspects with a precision traditional forensics never could. The FBI's combined DNA index system, CODIS, gradually grew into a massive repository of genetic profiles. For the first time, detectives could resubmit old evidence and hope for a hit against someone arrested years later in a completely different state. This alone led to hundreds of cold case breakthroughs. But DNA database hits have one critical limitation. They only work if the offender's DNA is already in the system. If a suspect has never been arrested for a qualifying offense, their profile will never appear in CODIS. That's where the next revolution came in. Starting around 2017 and 2018, investigators realized they could use something ordinary people were doing for fun, uploading their DNA to genealogy sites to learn about their ancestry, to identify violent offenders who had managed to stay out of criminal databases. The method is called forensic genetic genealogy. Here's how it works. A crime scene DNA sample is converted into a digital genetic profile and uploaded to an open-source site like GEDmatch. Investigators aren't looking for an exact match, they're looking for relatives. Even a distant match, a second or third cousin, can be enough for a trained genealogist to build a family tree using public records, then work forward in time to identify living males in the right age range, in the right geographic area, at the right time. Traditional police work takes over from there: quiet surveillance, trash pulls to collect discarded items, and laboratory comparisons between the suspect's discarded DNA and the original crime scene evidence. So, with that foundation, let's jump into the first case, one that terrorized California for over a decade and stumped investigators for 40 years. Case 1. The Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. Starting in the mid-70s, a masked attacker began prowling the bedroom communities of Sacramento, California. He struck at night, slipping through unlocked windows and sliding glass doors while families slept. His method was terrifyingly consistent. He'd wake couples by shining a flashlight in their faces, bind them with shoelaces he brought with him, then stack dishes on the husband's back and threaten to kill everyone in the house if he heard the plates fall. What followed were hours of terror. He would assault the wives while their husbands lay helpless just feet away. Sometimes he'd raid the refrigerator, sometimes he'd ransack the house for valuables. And then, as suddenly as he appeared, he'd vanish into the night. By the early 80s, the crimes in the Sacramento area were attributed to a serial rapist called the East Area Rapist. He was linked to more than 50 rapes and over 100 burglaries. Then, in 1979, the attacks shifted south. In Southern California, the violence escalated. The assaults turned into murders. Couples were bludgeoned and shot in their own homes. These homicides were blamed on a phantom known as the original Night Stalker. At the time, no one could prove the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. The evidence that could have tied those scenes together was there all along in biological material, carefully swabbed, dried, and sealed. It just lived in a language the science of the 70s couldn't yet read. By the mid-80s, the attacks stopped completely. The masked intruder, who had terrorized entire counties, simply disappeared. Investigators were left with boxes of evidence, hundreds of witness statements, and no suspect. Decades passed. Detectives retired, victims aged, some died, the case went cold. But the DNA evidence never disappeared. It sat in evidence lockers, waiting for science to catch up. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA testing finally allowed investigators to link the East Area Rapist crimes to the original Night Stalker murders. They were, in fact, the same offender. But even with that knowledge, they still had no name. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in CODIS. Then, in 2018, a cold case investigator named Paul Holes and a team of detectives decided to try something new. They took the killer's DNA profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. They weren't looking for the killer himself, they were looking for his relatives. The search returned a hit, a distant cousin. From there, a forensic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter began building a family tree, working backward through birth records, marriage certificates, and census data. She identified branches of the family, narrowed down the geographic locations, and eventually zeroed in on a handful of men who fit the age range and lived in the right areas during the time of the crimes. One name kept surfacing: Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo was a former police officer. He had worked for the Exeter Police Department in the early 70s and later for the Auburn Police Department, right in the heart of the East Area Rapists' hunting ground. He was fired from Auburn PD in 1979 for shoplifting, dog repellent, and a hammer. After that, he disappeared into a quiet suburban life. In April 2018, investigators began surveilling DeAngelo. He was 72 years old, living in a modest home in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. He was a grandfather. He tended his yard. He went to the grocery store. He looked like everyone's neighbor. Detectives waited until he threw something away. They collected items from his trash, a tissue, a discarded cup. They sent those items to the lab. And when the results came back, there was no doubt. The DNA matched. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer. It was Joseph James DeAngelo. On April 24, 2018, DeAngelo was arrested at his home. He appeared confused, frail, but the evidence was overwhelming. In June 2020, he stood in a Sacramento courtroom and pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. In August 2020, survivors and family members of victims filled the courtroom for his sentencing. Many were elderly themselves now. Some had waited more than 40 years for this moment. DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will die behind bars. But for many of the victims' families, the resolution came too late. Parents had already passed away. Siblings had spent their entire adult lives wondering who had shattered their sense of safety. DeAngelo's arrest proved that even the most careful predator leaves traces. But our next case shows how a killer can do the opposite, taunt police openly for years, and still disappear. Case 2. April Tinsley, John D. Miller. Real quick, if you're finding this story as intense as I am, go ahead and smash that like button. It helps more people discover these stories. On Good Friday, April 1st, 1988, 8-year-old April Tinsley left her home in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to walk to a friend's house just a few blocks away. She was a bright, happy kid. She loved drawing. She had her whole life ahead of her. She never made it to her friend's house. 3 days later, April's body was found in a ditch about 20 miles outside Fort Wayne, in a rural area of DeKalb County. She had been sexually assaulted and suffocated. The crime scene was horrific, but investigators did recover critical evidence, DNA, from the perpetrator. In 1988, DNA technology was still in its infancy. The profile was preserved, but there was no database to compare it against. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on tips. They looked at known offenders in the area, but the case went cold. And then, 16 years later, the killer resurfaced. In May 2004, 4 handwritten notes began appearing around Fort Wayne. They were left on bicycles, in mailboxes, tucked into screen doors, places where children would find them. The notes were obscene, taunting, and signed with a confession. I killed 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley. Along with the notes, the killer left Polaroid photos of himself, his body visible but his face obscured, and used condoms inside plastic bags. It was a brazen, sickening taunt. He wanted police to know he was still out there. He wanted the community to remember what he had done. Investigators tested the DNA on the condoms. It matched the DNA from April's body in 1988. They finally had confirmation. The same man who murdered April was still in the area, still free, and now openly mocking law enforcement. But even with fresh DNA evidence, there was still no match in CODIS. The killer had never been arrested for a crime that required a DNA sample. The case remained cold for another 14 years. Then, in 2018, the Fort Wayne Police Department decided to try forensic genetic genealogy. They partnered with a private lab called Parabon Nanolabs, which specialized in using DNA to build family trees. The lab took the killer's DNA profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch. The search returned several distant relatives. Genealogists began constructing a family tree, working through birth records, obituaries, and public documents. They narrowed the list down to a handful of men in the Fort Wayne area who fit the age range and geographic profile. One name stood out: John D. Miller. Miller was 59 years old. He worked at a factory. He lived a quiet, isolated life in a trailer on the outskirts of Fort Wayne. He had no criminal record. He had never been on law enforcement's radar. In July 2018, detectives began surveilling Miller. They waited for him to discard something, anything that could provide a DNA sample. When he threw away a cup and a cigarette butt, investigators collected them and sent them to the lab. The DNA was a match. On July 15, 2018, detectives knocked on Miller's door. They confronted him with the evidence, and within hours, John D. Miller confessed. He admitted to abducting, raping, and murdering April Tinsley in 1988. He admitted to leaving the taunting notes and photos in 2004. In December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 80 years in prison. April's mother, Janet Tinsley, had spent 30 years driving past the place where her daughter's body was found. She had endured 16 years of silence, then another 14 years knowing the killer was out there, taunting her community. Finally, she had a name. Finally, she had justice. What time is it where you are? I'm curious how many of you are watching this late at night like I recorded it. April's case showed how DNA can name a stranger. But what happens when the killer isn't a stranger at all? When they're someone the victim knew, even trusted? Case 3. Sherry Rasmussen, Stephanie Lazarus. On February 24, 1986, 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen was found dead inside the condo she shared with her husband, John Ruetten, in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles. She had been beaten, bitten, and shot 3 times. The condo was in disarray, drawers pulled open, electronics missing. To the responding officers, it looked like a burglary gone wrong. Sherry was a critical care nurse at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. She was smart, ambitious, and newly married. She and John had been together for just 3 months. They were building a life together. And now she was gone. The Los Angeles Police Department opened a homicide investigation. Detectives noted the signs of a struggle. Sherry had fought back hard. There was a bite mark on her left forearm, deep, clear, and preserved in photographs. A forensic dentist examined it and determined it had been made by a woman. Sherry's parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, immediately told detectives they believed they knew who was responsible: Stephanie Lazarus. Stephanie Lazarus was an LAPD officer. She had dated John Ruetten on and off for several years before he met Sherry. Even after John and Sherry got engaged, Lazarus continued to contact him. She showed up at his workplace. She called him repeatedly. Sherry told friends and family that Lazarus had confronted her, warning her to stay away from John. Just weeks before the murder, Lazarus had visited Sherry at the hospital where she worked. Witnesses said the encounter was tense. Sherry later told her mother she felt threatened. But when the Rasmussens brought this information to the LAPD, detectives dismissed it. Lazarus was a cop. She had an alibi. The crime scene looked like a burglary. The investigation focused on transient criminals and gang activity in the area. The case went nowhere. DNA was swabbed from the bite mark on Sherry's arm and preserved. But in 1986, DNA profiling was not yet standard practice in criminal investigations. The sample sat in an evidence freezer, untested, for over 2 decades. The case went cold. Sherry's parents never stopped believing Lazarus was responsible, but they had no power to force the LAPD to investigate one of its own. Then, in 2004, the LAPD formed a dedicated cold case unit. In 2009, Detective Jim Nuttall pulled Sherry Rasmussen's file. He read through the reports. He saw the bite mark. He saw the female DNA. And he saw the name Stephanie Lazarus in the notes mentioned by the victim's parents, then ignored. Nuttall ordered the DNA from the bite mark to be analyzed. The profile came back female. It didn't match anyone in CODIS, but Nuttall knew that didn't mean anything if the suspect had never been arrested. He began quietly investigating Stephanie Lazarus. By 2009, she was a detective herself, working in the LAPD's Commercial Crimes Division. She had been with the department for over 20 years. She was married. She had a daughter. She had built a career and a life. Nuttall and his team needed a DNA sample from Lazarus without tipping her off. They set up an undercover operation. In June 2009, detectives staged a fake meeting and offered Lazarus a cup of water. After she drank from it and discarded it, they collected the cup and sent it to the lab. The DNA was a match. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was arrested at LAPD headquarters. She was brought into an interrogation room and confronted with the evidence. She denied everything. She claimed she barely remembered Sherry Rasmussen. She said she hadn't seen John Ruetten in years. But the DNA didn't lie. In March 2012, after a trial that gripped Los Angeles, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder. The motive was clear: jealousy and obsession. She couldn't let go of John Ruetten, and when he married Sherry, Lazarus snapped. She went to the condo that day, not to burglarize it, but to confront Sherry. The confrontation turned violent. Lazarus beat her, bit her, and shot her 3 times. Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Sherry's parents, Nels and Loretta, had been right all along. For 23 years, they had been dismissed, ignored, and told they were wrong. The LAPD had failed to investigate one of its own, and that failure allowed a killer to walk free for over 2 decades. Sherry's case exposed how tunnel vision can bury the truth. Our next case reveals something even more disturbing, how the wrong person can end up behind bars while the real killer walks free. Case 4. Angie Dodge Brian Lee Dripps, Sr., Chris Tapp exoneration. Before we continue, I just want to say if these stories are affecting you, you're not alone. That's why we tell them. If you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss future cases. On June 13, 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was found dead in her apartment in Idaho Falls, Idaho. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and mutilated. The crime scene was brutal. Investigators recovered a pristine semen sample from Angie's body, clear, uncontaminated DNA evidence that should have led them directly to the killer. Instead, it led them to the wrong man. Angie's murder sent shockwaves through Idaho Falls, a quiet city of about 50,000 people. The community demanded answers. Police felt pressure to solve the case quickly. Within months, they focused their attention on a 20-year-old named Chris Tapp. Tapp was an acquaintance of Angie's. He had no criminal history. He wasn't a suspect initially, but after hours of intense, coercive interrogation, some of which was recorded, Tapp confessed to being present during the murder. He said he held Angie down while another man, Benjamin Hobbs, assaulted and killed her. There was just one problem. Tapp's DNA didn't match the semen recovered from Angie's body. Neither did Hobbs's DNA. The biological evidence emphatically said neither man had sexually assaulted Angie Dodge. But prosecutors moved forward anyway. They argued that a third, unidentified man must have been involved. In 1998, Chris Tapp was convicted of rape and murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Benjamin Hobbs was never charged. For the next 20 years, Tapp sat in an Idaho prison for a crime the DNA said he didn't commit. His case became a flashpoint for wrongful conviction advocates. Experts reviewed the interrogation tapes and found textbook examples of coercion, leading questions, promises of leniency, and psychological pressure that can cause innocent people to confess to crimes they didn't commit. Meanwhile, the real killer's DNA sat in evidence, waiting. In 2019, the Idaho Falls Police Department partnered with Parabon Nanolabs to use forensic genetic genealogy on the unknown DNA profile from Angie's body. The profile was uploaded to GEDinMatch. Genealogists built a family tree from distant relatives and began working forward through generations. The tree led them to a man named Brian Lee Dripps, Sr. Dripps was 43 years old. He had a criminal record, but nothing that required a DNA sample in CODIS. And here's the most haunting detail. In 1996, at the time of Angie's murder, Brian Dripps lived directly across the street from her apartment. Detectives surveilled Dripps and collected a discarded cigarette butt. The DNA matched. In May 2019, Dripps was arrested. When confronted, he admitted to entering Angie Dodge's apartment, sexually assaulting her, and killing her. He said he acted alone. He had never met Chris Tapp. He had never met Benjamin Hobbs. Chris Tapp had spent 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. In July 2019, Chris Tapp was fully exonerated. All charges were dismissed. He walked out of prison a free man, but he had lost 2 decades of his life. Brian Dripps pleaded guilty to rape and murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life. Angie Dodge's mother, Carol, had fought for years to reopen the case. She believed Chris Tapp was innocent. She wanted the real killer found. When Dripps was finally arrested, she said she felt relief but also anger. Anger that it took so long. Anger that an innocent man had been imprisoned. anger that her daughter's real killer had been living across the street the entire time. What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny? Rainy? Let me know in the comments. Angie's case is a reminder that DNA doesn't just convict, it can also free the innocent. Our final case proves that even evidence stored for nearly 50 years can still speak loud enough to bring a killer to justice. Case 5. Carla Walker, Glenn Samuel McCurley. On the night of February 17, 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, attended a Valentine's dance at their high school in Fort Worth, Texas. Carla was a cheerleader, popular, full of life. After the dance, the couple went to a local bowling alley to hang out with friends. Around midnight, Carla and Rodney walked to his car in the parking lot. They sat talking for a few minutes. Then, without warning, the driver's side door was ripped open. A man grabbed Rodney, pistol-whipped him, and knocked him unconscious. When Rodney came to, Carla was gone. Rodney stumbled back into the bowling alley, bleeding from his head, screaming for help. Police were called immediately. A massive search began, but Carla had vanished. 3 days later, on February 20th, Carla's body was found in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, about 10 miles from the bowling alley. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her hands were tied behind her back. She was still wearing the bra she had on the night she was taken. Investigators collected evidence from Carla's body and clothing, including semen and a piece of a gun magazine that had broken off during the attack. They interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at Rodney McCoy, he was cleared. They looked at known offenders in the area. They followed up on tips for years. But the case went cold. Detectives retired. Carla's family held on to hope, but as the years turned into decades, that hope began to fade. The evidence carefully preserved in the Fort Worth Police Department's storage sat untouched for 46 years. Then, in 2020, a new generation of detectives decided to take another look. Advances in DNA technology and the emergence of forensic genetic genealogy offered a chance to finally solve the case. The DNA from the semen on Carla's clothing was sent to Othram, a private lab specializing in forensic genealogy. The lab built a genetic profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch. Genealogists began constructing a family tree from distant relatives. The tree pointed to a man named Glenn Samuel McCurley. He was 77 years old and still living in Fort Worth, not far from where Carla had been abducted. In 1974, he would have been in his late 20s. He had no significant criminal record. He had never been on investigators' radar. Detectives began surveilling McCurley. They waited for him to discard something they could test. When he threw away a soda can, they collected it and sent it to the lab. The DNA matched the semen from Carla's clothing. On September 21, 2020, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested and charged with capital murder. When confronted with the evidence, he eventually admitted to abducting, sexually assaulting, and killing Carla Walker in 1974. In 2021, McCurley pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Carla's family, her former classmates, and Rodney McCoy, who had lived for 46 years, knowing he was the last person to see her alive, finally had closure. Rodney, now in his 60s, said he had never stopped thinking about that night. He had never stopped feeling guilty that he couldn't protect her. When McCurley was arrested, Rodney said he felt a weight lift that he had carried for nearly half a century. Carla's case is proof that justice doesn't have an expiration date, not when the evidence is protected and the will to solve it remains. 5 cases, 5 victims, 5 families who waited decades for answers. Joseph James DeAngelo terrorized California for over a decade and disappeared into suburban anonymity for 40 years. John D. Miller murdered a child and taunted a community for 16 years. Stephanie Lazarus wore a badge while hiding a murder for 23 years. Brian Dripps lived across the street from his victim while an innocent man sat in prison. Glenn McCurley walked free for 46 years while Carla Walker's family drove past the place she was found over and over, waiting for justice. These cases span different decades, different states, different circumstances, but they all share a common thread: DNA and determination. For years, the evidence sat in boxes, in freezers, in forgotten corners of police stations. It waited for science to catch up. It waited for someone to care enough to reopen the file. And when that moment finally came, when forensic genetic genealogy gave investigators a new tool, the past came roaring back. These stories remind us that the past doesn't stay buried forever, families don't forget, and the evidence, if it's preserved, never stops speaking. But these cases also expose the cracks in the system: tunnel vision, coerced confessions, institutional bias, the refusal to investigate one of your own, the pressure to close a case quickly, even if it means convicting the wrong person. DNA can convict the guilty, but it can also free the innocent. Chris Tapp's story is proof of that. And it's a warning. How many other people are sitting in prison right now for crimes the DNA says they didn't commit? Right now, across the United States, hundreds of cold cases are being reopened. Evidence that sat untouched for decades is being resubmitted for modern analysis. Genealogists are building family trees. Detectives are knocking on doors. And killers who thought they were safe are being confronted with the one thing they couldn't destroy: their own DNA. Justice doesn't have an expiration date. Not anymore. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. These stories matter, and so does your engagement. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments which case shocked you the most. Was it D'Angelo hiding in plain sight? Miller's taunting notes? Lazarus being a cop? Tapp's wrongful conviction? Or McCurley walking free for 46 years? I'll see you in the next one.